56-year-old Damian Reyes sold his truck and spent his last dollar on a one-way ticket to Dallas for a job interview that could change everything for him and his daughter. At dawn in the airport security line, he watched a frail elderly woman drop her handbag, scattering insulin vials and family photos across the floor. While other passengers stepped around her, Damian made a choice that would cost him his flight. He helped her to her feet, found a wheelchair, and stayed through the medical paperwork until she was cleared. By the time he reached his gate, his plane was already disappearing into the morning sky. Broke and defeated, Damian prepared to sleep in the terminal when an airline executive approached him with an unexpected invitation to a private lounge. What Damian didn't know was that the helpless old woman he'd helped was actually Sylvia Carrington, the billionaire founder of the entire airline. But would her gratitude be enough to transform his life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn silence at 4:30 a.m. But Damian Reyes was already awake. He'd been staring at the water-stained ceiling of their cramped apartment for the past hour, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. Today was the day that could change everything, or confirm his worst suspicions that he was destined to remain trapped in a cycle of financial desperation. Damian rolled out of the second-hand mattress that served as his bed, careful not to disturb the sheets. Every sound seemed amplified in the thin-walled apartment, and he couldn't risk waking Lila. His 12-year-old daughter needed her sleep, especially with school starting in just a few hours. He padded quietly to the kitchenette, where his interview suit hung from a plastic hanger on the refrigerator handle, the only suit he owned, purchased from a thrift store 3 years ago, and pressed the night before with an iron he'd borrowed. For Mrs. Chan next door, the coffee maker had broken 2 weeks ago, another casualty in their ongoing battle against a budget that never seemed to stretch far enough. Instead, Damian boiled water in their one decent pot and stirred an instant coffee, the bitter granules dissolving into a dark liquid that would have to substitute for the caffeine he desperately needed. As he sipped the harsh brew, he pulled out his phone and checked his bank balance one more time. $47.23. After the taxi to the airport and the flight to Dallas, he'd have maybe $15 left to his name. The weight of that number settled heavy in his chest. $15, to last until his next unemployment check, assuming he didn't get this job. $15 to buy groceries, to keep the lights on, to maintain the precarious stability that kept him and Lila afloat. He'd already sold everything of value, his tools, his watch, even his wedding ring from his brief marriage to Lila's mother, who'd left when the responsibility of parenthood became too real. Yesterday, he'd finally let go of his pickup truck, the last symbol of his independence, trading it to a used car dealer for just enough cash to cover the plane ticket. Damian heard the soft rustle of blankets from Lila's corner of the studio apartment. She slept behind a curtain he'd hung to give her some privacy, a makeshift bedroom carved out of their shared space. Through the thin fabric, he could see her silhouette as she stirred awake. "Dad?" Her voice was thick with sleep, concern. "Is it time? Go back to sleep, sweetheart?" he whispered. "I've got a few more hours before I need to leave." But Lila was already pushing aside the curtain, her dark hair so much like her mother's falling in messy waves around her shoulders. She wore an oversized t-shirt that had once been his, and despite being only 12, she carried herself with a maturity that both proud and broke Damian's heart. No child should have to grow up as fast as Lila had been forced to. "I made you something," she said, padding to the small table where her school books were scattered. She picked up a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a library book she'd renewed 3 times, because she couldn't bear to return it, and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper from between the pages. Damian took the paper with careful hands, unfolding it to reveal a hand-drawn card. On the front, she'd sketched a simple airplane with "Good luck, Dad," written in her careful cursive. Inside, in pencil that had been pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the paper, she'd written, "You're going to get this job because you're the best dad in the world. When you come back, we'll celebrate with ice cream. I love you." Lila, the tightness in Damien's throat made it difficult to speak. "Lila, this is beautiful. I used the good markers from school," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Mrs. Rodriguez said I could borrow them for something special." Damien studied his daughter's face in the dim light from the kitchen fixture. She'd inherited his stubborn chin and her mother's expressive eyes, but the combination created something entirely her own, a fierce intelligence tempered by compassion that constantly amazed him. Despite their circumstances, despite the times, he'd had to explain why they couldn't afford new shoes or why they ate mac and cheese 4 nights a week. Lila never complained. She threw herself into her studies with a determination that reminded him why he fought so hard to keep them going. "Tell me about the job again," she said, propping her chin on her hands. Damien had described it to her a dozen times, but he understood her need to hear it again. The routine was comforting, a way to make the possibility feel more real. "It's at a refinery in Dallas. Equipment maintenance and safety inspection. The pay is good, really good. Enough for us to get a 2-bedroom apartment, maybe even in a better school district. And I could have my own room?" Lila's eyes lit up with the same excitement she'd shown every time they'd discussed this possibility. "Your own room, your own desk for homework, maybe even space for some bookshelves." Damien reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You could check out as many library books as you want and actually have somewhere to keep them. What if they don't like you?" The question came out smaller than her usual confident tone, revealing the fear she'd been trying to hide. "Then we'll figure something else out," Damien said, though the words felt hollow even to him. There wasn't really another option. He'd exhausted every local job lead, every contact from his previous work in construction and maintenance. The industry had been brutal in recent years, with experienced workers competing for fewer and fewer positions. At 56, Damien often found himself passed over for younger candidates, despite his decades of experience and spotless safety record. "But they will like you," Lila said with fierce certainty, "because you're smart and you work harder than anyone and you fix things that other people can't fix." Her faith in him was both inspiring and terrifying. Damien had spent the last 3 years trying to live up to the image Lila him, the father who could solve any problem, who would always find a way. But the truth was more complicated. He was tired, worn down by the constant stress of making ends meet, by the weight of single parenthood, by the knowledge that one missed payment or unexpected expense could send their carefully balanced life tumbling into chaos. "I should let you get ready," Lila said, standing and smoothing down her oversized shirt. "But Dad?" She paused at the curtain to her sleeping area. "Even if you don't get this job, you're still the best dad. Nothing changes that." Damien watched her disappear behind the curtain, heard the soft sounds of her settling back into bed. The card she'd made him lay open on the table, her careful drawing of the airplane pointing toward an uncertain future. He folded it gently and slipped it into his wallet, where it would stay close to his heart throughout the long day ahead. The next hour passed in quiet preparation. Damien showered in their tiny bathroom, where the hot water lasted exactly 6 minutes if he was lucky. He shaved with a disposable razor that had seen better days and tried to tame his graying hair with drugstore gel. The face that looked back at him in the mirror showed every one of his 56 years lines around his eyes from squinting in construction site sun. Calloused hands that told the story of manual labor, shoulders that had carried more weight than they should have. But there was something else in that reflection, something he'd almost forgotten during the lean years: determination. The same quality that had gotten him through technical school, through his early career, through the challenges of unexpected single parenthood. The same quality that Lila saw in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. By 6 a.m., Damien was dressed in his thrift store suit, his resume printed on the good paper he'd splurged on at the office supply store, his interview materials organized in a folder that Lila had decorated with encouraging stickers. The taxi would arrive in 20 minutes to take him to the airport, beginning a journey that would either mark the turning point in their lives or confirm his worst fears about their future. As he waited, Damien sat at the small table and pulled out his phone to check the flight details one more time. Flight 447 to Dallas, departing at 8:15 a.m. The ticket had cost more than their monthly grocery budget, but it represented hope, the kind of hope he'd been afraid to feel for too long. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Chun starting her morning routine next door, the familiar sounds of an elderly woman beginning another day alone. In the distance, the city was waking up, garbage trucks rumbling down the street, early commuters starting their cars, the world moving forward with the assumption that everyone had somewhere important to go. Damien Reyes had somewhere important to go too. For the first time in months, he had a destination that promised more than just survival. As he tucked Lila's card deeper into his wallet and prepared to leave everything familiar behind, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, today would be the day their luck finally changed. The taxi dropped Damien at the airport terminal at 6:45 a.m., giving him what should have been plenty of time for his 8:15 flight. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of a clear day, a good omen, he hoped. He paid the driver with bills he'd counted 3 times the night before, leaving him with the $15 he'd calculated would have to last until his return. Inside the terminal, a usual chaos of air travel was already building. Business. Travelers wheeled carry-on bags with the efficient confidence of people who live their lives in airports. Families clustered around departure boards, parents juggling coffee cups and anxious children. Damien found his place in the security line, clutching his boarding pass and driver's license with hands that were steadier than he felt. The line moved with typical airport sluggishness, stop and start, a few steps forward and another wait. Damien checked his phone repeatedly, calculating and recalculating the time he'd need to reach his gate. 7:30 a.m. now. Still plenty of time, but the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing minute. 3 people ahead of him, an elderly woman, was struggling with her belongings. She appeared to be in her late 70s, with silver hair pinned back in an elegant style that suggested she'd once been accustomed to better circumstances. Her clothes were quality, a wool coat that had seen many seasons but was well maintained. Sensible shoes that spoke of practicality over fashion. But something about her movements seemed off. A slight tremor in her hands as she tried to organize her carry-on bag. As the line lurched forward again, disaster struck. The woman's handbag slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a soft thud that somehow seemed to echo in the busy terminal. The bag's contents scattered across the polished floor, insulin vials rolling in different directions, family photographs sliding under other passengers' feet, prescription bottles skittering toward the security checkpoint. The woman made a soft sound of distress, reaching down toward the scattered items with movements that were clearly painful. Around her, other passengers stepped carefully around the mess, some offering polite but hurried "excuse me" as they navigated around her belongings. A few people glanced down with sympathy, but the urgency of catching flights, the universal airport anxiety, kept them moving forward. Damien didn't think. Later, he would remember this moment as purely instinctual, the same response that had made him a good father, a reliable employee, the kind of person neighbors called when they needed help. He stepped out of line and knelt beside the woman, his interview suit be damned. "Here, let me help you," he said gently, already gathering the scattered insulin vials. Up close, he could see that the woman's hands were shaking more than he'd initially noticed. Not nervousness, but something medical. Diabetes, probably severe, given the amount of medical supplies in her bag. "Oh, you don't need to," she began, but her voice was shaky with embarrassment and what might have been pain. "It's no trouble at all," Damien assured her carefully, collecting the family photographs. He caught glimpses of the images. A young woman in a graduation cap, children at various ages, what looked like a wedding photo from decades past. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need medical attention?" The woman, Sylvia, though Damien didn't know her name, yet looked up at him with eyes that were sharp despite her physical distress. There was something assessing in her gaze, as if she were taking his measure in a way that went beyond simple gratitude for his help. "I'm having a bit of a blood sugar episode," she admitted quietly. "I may have miscalculated my insulin this morning." Damien helped her to her feet, noting how frail she felt despite her composed demeanor. "Do you have someone traveling with you?" "Family? I'm traveling alone," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested this was both. Unusual and perhaps unwise. "I really should be fine in a few minutes." But Damien could see that she wasn't fine. The tremor in her hands was getting worse, and there was a slight grayness to her complexion that he recognized from his brief stint as a volunteer MT years ago. Low blood sugar could be dangerous, especially for someone her age. "I think we should get you some medical assistance," he said firmly but kindly, "just to be safe." The security line had moved forward without them, and Damien could see his gate number appearing on the departure board. His flight would begin boarding in 30 minutes. But looking at this woman, at Sylvia, he knew he couldn't leave her alone in her current state. "I don't want to cause a fuss," she protested, but her voice was weaker now. "No fuss," Damien said, "just being careful." He flagged down a TSA officer, explaining the situation with the calm competence that had served him well in emergency situations throughout his life. Within minutes, airport medical personnel arrived with a wheelchair and glucose tablets. Damien stayed with Sylvia as they checked her blood, sugar dangerously low, and began the process of stabilizing her condition. "Sir, are you family?" one of the medical technicians asked. "No, just a fellow passenger who happened to be nearby," Damien replied, glancing at his watch. 7:50 a.m. Boarding would start soon. "If you need to catch your flight," Sylvia began, but Damien was already shaking his head. "I'm not going anywhere until I know you're okay," he said, and meant it completely. The medical team worked efficiently, but airport protocols required paperwork, verification of her medical information, and a waiting period to ensure her blood. Sugar stabilized. Damien found himself answering questions about what he'd observed, providing his contact information as a witness to the incident. He held Sylvia's purse while they worked, noting again the quality of the items inside expensive reading glasses. A leather checkbook from a bank he didn't recognize, business cards from what appeared to be high-end establishments. "You're missing your flight," Sylvia said when her condition had improved enough for conversation. There was something in her voice, guilt, yes, but also what sounded like surprise. Damien looked up at the departure board. Flight 447 to Dallas was now boarding. Group A. "There'll be other flights," he said, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true for someone in his financial position. "This is very kind of you," she said, studying his face with those sharp eyes. Most people would have done the same thing," Damien replied, though they both knew that wasn't true either. By the time Sylvia was cleared by medical personnel and able to continue through security, Damien's flight was in the air. He watched through the terminal windows as it taxied down the runway, carrying with it his best hope for employment, for pulling himself and Lila out of their financial spiral. The weight of what he'd lost hit him as he stood alone in the security area, Sylvia having been whisked through the expedited lane by airline personnel, who seemed unusually attentive to her needs. His ticket was non-refundable. His interview was scheduled for this afternoon. The company had been clear that they were interviewing candidates this week only. Making decisions immediately, Damien sank into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs near the security checkpoint. His suit wrinkled now from kneeling on the airport floor, his carefully planned timeline shattered. $15 in his pocket, no return ticket, and nowhere to sleep but the airport terminal until he could figure out his next move. He pulled out his phone to call Lila, to somehow explain how her father had sacrificed their future for a stranger. But before he could dial, he heard his name being called. "Excuse me, Mr. Reyes?" Damien looked up to see a woman in an expensive suit, her hair pulled back in a professional style, her bearing suggesting corporate authority. She held a tablet and wore the kind of confident expression that belonged to someone accustomed to solving problems. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Staff for Skyglide Air," she said, extending her hand. "I understand you missed your flight this morning while helping one of our passengers." Damien stood, confused. "I'm sorry. How did you—" "Mrs. Carrington asked me to find you," Sarah continued. "She'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment. Would you be willing to accompany me to our executive lounge?" Damien stared at her, processing the words, but not quite understanding their meaning. "Mrs. Carrington?" "The passenger you helped." "This morning," Sarah clarified, already gesturing toward a corridor Damien hadn't noticed before. "She's quite eager to thank you properly for your assistance." Still bewildered, Damien followed Sarah through the terminal, past gates and shops, and the ordinary chaos of air travel, toward whatever strange turn his already surreal morning was about to take. Sarah Mitchell moved through the airport with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged everywhere and questioned nothing. Damien followed, still processing the surreal turn his morning had taken. They walked past the main terminal's bustle, through a doorway marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and into a corridor that felt distinctly separate from the chaos he'd left behind. "I have to ask," Damien said as they walked, "how did you know my name?" "I don't remember giving it to anyone, except the medical team." Sarah glanced back with a slight smile. "Mrs. Carrington has her ways of finding out what she needs to know. She was quite impressed by your actions this morning." They stopped at an unmarked door that Sarah opened with a key card that appeared to grant access to areas most passengers never saw. Beyond the door lay an elevator with polished brass fixtures and soft lighting that was a world away from the harsh fluorescence of the main terminal. "Executive level," Sarah explained as they rose smoothly upward. "Skyglide Air maintains private facilities in major airports for our board members and special guests." The elevator opened onto what could only be described as a luxury hotel lobby that happened to be suspended above an airport. Rich carpeting muffled their footsteps, and floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic views of the runways below. Leather furniture was arranged in intimate conversation areas, and the subtle lighting created an atmosphere of calm that seemed impossible given their location. Damien had worked construction jobs in upscale buildings, had glimpsed the world of corporate luxury from the outside, but he'd never experienced it as anything other than an observer. Now, walking across this pristine carpet in his thrift store suit, he felt the full weight of the class divide that separated his daily struggles from whatever world this represented. "Can I offer you coffee? Something to eat?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward a buffet area where fresh pastries and fruit were arranged with the kind of casual elegance that suggested money was no object. "Coffee would be great," Damien admitted. He hadn't eaten since the instant coffee and single piece of toast that had constituted his breakfast. Sarah prepared his coffee with the efficiency of someone accustomed to hospitality, using what appeared to be an expensive espresso machine. The coffee, when she handed it to him, was better than anything he'd tasted in years, rich and complex, in a way that made his morning's instant coffee seem like a cruel joke. "Mrs. Carrington will be with you shortly," Sarah said, settling into a chair across from him. She's just finishing up with some medical clearance paperwork. Nothing serious, she added quickly, seeing his concern. Just standard procedure after a blood sugar incident. Damien nodded, sipping the extraordinary coffee and trying to make sense of his surroundings. Through the windows, he could see planes, taxiing and taking off with the regular rhythm of a busy airport. But from this vantage point, the chaos looked orchestrated, almost peaceful. I have to ask, Sarah continued, her tone shifting slightly toward the professional, what you were traveling to Dallas for. Mrs. Carrington mentioned you seemed concerned about missing your flight. Job interview, Damien replied. Refinery work. Equipment maintenance and safety inspection. And you missed it to help a stranger. The way Sarah said it made it sound like a question, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Damien set down his coffee cup, suddenly aware that this conversation might be heading somewhere he didn't understand. Anyone would have done the same thing, he said, echoing what he'd told Mrs. Carrington earlier. Would they? Sarah asked. In my experience, airport emergencies tend to bring out either the best or the worst in people. Most choose to prioritize their own schedules. Before Damien could respond, he heard the soft ding of the elevator, and, moments later, Mrs. Carrington Sylvia appeared in the lounge. She looked remarkably different than she had an hour ago. The medical crisis had passed, and whatever treatments she'd received had restored the natural authority to her bearing. She moved with the careful precision of someone who was older, but far from frail, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of sharp intelligence and decades of experience making decisions that mattered. Mr. Reyes, she said, approaching with her hand extended, I wanted to thank you properly for your assistance this morning. Damien stood, accepting her handshake and noting the firmness of her grip. I'm just glad you're feeling better. You gave me quite a scare there. I imagine I did, Sylvia replied, settling into the chair beside Sarah's. My doctor has been warning me about traveling alone, but I'm afraid I'm rather stubborn about maintaining my independence. Independence is important, Damien agreed, thinking of his own struggles to maintain autonomy in the face of financial pressure. But so is accepting help when you need it. Sylvia studied him with those sharp eyes, and Damien had the distinct impression he was being evaluated in ways he didn't understand. Sarah tells me you were traveling to Dallas for employment. That's right, though I suppose that opportunity has passed now. Damien tried to keep the disappointment out of his voice, but suspected he wasn't entirely successful. What kind of work? Refinery maintenance. Safety inspections, equipment repair, preventive maintenance scheduling. I've been in industrial maintenance for over 20 years. And you're willing to relocate for work? Damien hesitated. The truth was complicated. He was willing to do whatever it took to provide for Lila, but leaving her behind wasn't really an option, and uprooting her from the only home she'd known carried its own risks. It depends on the situation, he said carefully. I have a 12-year-old daughter. She's my priority in any decision I make. Something shifted in Sylvia's expression. At the mention of Lila, the evaluation in her eyes softened into something that might have been recognition or sympathy. A single father, she said, not quite a question. For the past 8 years, yes. That's not easy. No, Damien agreed. But it's worth it. She's an amazing kid, brilliant actually. Loves to read, does well in school despite everything. She deserves better than what I've been able to provide lately. The honesty of that admission surprised him. He wasn't usually so forthcoming with strangers, but something about this strange morning, about missing his flight and finding himself in this impossible luxury, had stripped away his usual protective barriers. Sylvia and Sarah exchanged a look that Damien couldn't interpret, but it seemed to carry significance. Mr. Reyes, Sylvia said finally, would you be interested in hearing about a different opportunity? Something that might not require you to relocate, or at least not relocate. Far? Damien felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, though he was afraid to let it grow too strong. I'd be interested in hearing about anything, honestly. Sarah, Sylvia said, turning to her assistant, could you pull up the specifications for the maintenance supervisor position we've been trying to fill at the regional facility? As Sarah began working on her tablet, Sylvia turned back to Damien. Tell me, Mr. Reyes, in your professional opinion, what's the most important quality in someone responsible for safety and maintenance in an industrial setting? Damien considered the question, sensing that his answer mattered more than the casual tone suggested. Attention to detail, obviously. Technical competence. But honestly, I think the most important thing is giving a damn about the people who depend on your work. Equipment fails, it's going to happen. But if you really care about the consequences of that failure, if you understand that someone's life might depend on whether you notice that bearing that's starting to wear or catch that stress crack before it becomes critical, then you'll do the work right. Sylvia nodded slowly. And how do you evaluate whether someone has that kind of caring? You watch how they treat people when there's nothing in it for them, Damien replied without hesitation. You watch what they do when no one's looking, when there's no reward except knowing they did the right thing. The silence that followed felt weighted with significance, though Damien wasn't sure why. Through the windows, another plane was taking off, carrying passengers toward destinations and possibilities that suddenly felt both very far away and surprisingly close. Sarah looked up from her tablet with the efficient satisfaction of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. The position is available immediately, she announced. Regional Maintenance Supervisor for our southeastern facilities, based primarily out of our Atlanta hub, but covering facilities within a 3-hour drive. Damien felt his coffee cup grow heavy in his hands. Atlanta was less than 2 hours from where he and Lila lived, close enough to maintain stability, far enough to represent a real change. What kind of facilities? Aircraft maintenance hangars, administrative buildings, some cargo operations, Sylvia replied, settling back in her chair with the air of someone preparing for a longer conversation. The position oversees a team of 12 maintenance professionals and coordinates with safety inspectors from the FAA. You're talking about airline maintenance, Damien said, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. I don't have experience with aircraft specifically, but you have experience with complex mechanical systems operating under strict safety protocols. Sylvia interrupted gently. Sarah, show him the technical specifications. As Sarah turned her tablet toward him, Damien found himself looking at detailed schematics and job requirements that, while aircraft-specific, drew heavily on the same principles he'd been applying in industrial settings for decades. Hydraulic systems, electrical maintenance, structural integrity monitoring. The context was different, but the fundamental skills were remarkably similar. The salary, Sarah continued, starts at $85,000 annually with performance, bonuses, and full benefits, including health insurance, dental, and a college savings program for dependents. The number hit Damien like a physical blow. $85,000 was more than he'd made in his best year, more than double what he'd been hoping for with the Dallas position. It was the kind of salary that could transform Lila's life private. School if she wanted it, college without crushing debt, the security he'd been dreaming of providing. That's very generous, he managed, though the words felt inadequate. But I have to ask, why me? You don't know anything about my work history, my qualifications, my references. Sylvia reached into her purse, the same leather bag that had scattered its contents across the airport floor that morning, and pulled out a business card. She handed it to Damien, and as he read it, the final piece of the morning's puzzle clicked into place. Sylvia Carrington, Chairman Emeritus, Skyglide Airlines, he read aloud, looking up at her with new understanding. You own the airline. I founded it, actually, Sylvia corrected with a slight smile. 47 years ago, when people told me a woman had no business starting an airline. I've been Chairman Emeritus for the past 5 years, which means I'm officially retired, but still maintain significant oversight of our operations. Damien stared at the business card, then at the woman who had gone from medical emergency to billionaire airline founder in the span of a morning. And you are traveling alone? In economy? I make a point of flying incognito several times a year, Sylvia explained. It's the only way to see how our frontline staff really treat passengers, how our systems actually work under normal conditions. This morning's flight was supposed to be one of those inspection trips. Supposed to be? Well, I ended up in the terminal medical facility instead of observing our gate operations, Sylvia said with dry humor. Though I'd argue I learned more about our passenger experience than I would have otherwise. Sarah leaned forward. Mrs. Carrington specifically designs these trips to test our customer service protocols. She's been doing them since the airline's early days. And what did you learn this morning? Damien asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I learned that while our medical response team is excellent and our staff handled the emergency professionally, only one person in that entire security line cared enough to help a fellow passenger in distress, Sylvia replied. Everyone else had somewhere more important to be. Damien set down his coffee cup, processing the implications of what she was telling him. So this job offer is based on the most important interview you'll ever have, Sylvia finished. One you didn't know you were taking, in a situation where you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. The weight of the morning's decisions settled over Damien with new significance. His choice to help had been instinctual, driven by basic human decency rather than any calculation of personal benefit. But that choice had revealed something about his character that no traditional interview could have uncovered. I still don't understand, he said slowly. You could hire anyone, people with airline experience, advanced degrees, connections in the industry. I could, Sylvia agreed, and often do. But technical skills can be taught. Industry knowledge can be learned. What I saw from you this morning, the genuine concern for another person's welfare, that willingness to sacrifice your own interests for someone who needed help, that's not something you can teach someone in their 50s. Either you have it or you don't. She paused, her sharp eyes studying his face. Plus, I did a little research while I was dealing with the medical paperwork. Your former supervisors speak very highly of your work ethic and reliability. Your safety record is spotless. And your financial situation suggests someone who understands the value of steady employment. Damien felt heat rise in his cheeks at the mention of his financial circumstances. You investigated my background? I'm offering you a position of significant responsibility, Sylvia replied matter-of-factly. Of course I investigated your background. What I found was a man who's been knocked down by circumstances but never stopped fighting for his daughter's future. Someone who's made difficult choices with integrity, even when easier options were available. Sarah consulted her tablet again. Your former supervisor at Morrison Construction said you were the most reliable person he'd ever worked with. Never missed a deadline, never cut corners on safety protocols, always willing to stay late to finish a job properly. Jim Morrison said that? Damien asked, surprised. His layoff from Morrison Construction had been purely economic last hired. First fired when the housing market collapsed, but he hadn't known his work had made such an impression. He also said he'd hire you back in a heartbeat if business picked up, Sarah continued. And your daughter's teachers describe her as exceptionally bright and well-adjusted despite difficult circumstances. That says something about the kind of parent you are. The thoroughness of their investigation was both flattering and slightly unnerving. But as Damien considered it, he realized that if he were offering someone a high-paying position based on a single morning's interaction, he'd probably do the same kind of background check. So what happens now? He asked, afraid to hope too much, but unable to suppress the feeling that his life was balanced on the edge of transformation. Now, Sylvia said, standing with the decisive movement of someone accustomed to making important decisions quickly, we take a little trip to Atlanta, so you can see the facility and meet the team you'd be supervising. If you're interested, that is. Damien looked from Sylvia to Sarah, then out the window at the busy airport below. Somewhere out there, his original flight was probably landing in Dallas, carrying other job candidates to interviews he'd never make. But here, in this impossible luxury overlooking the runways, a different kind of opportunity was taking shape. "I'm interested," he said, and meant it completely. 20 minutes later, Damien found himself walking across the tarmac toward a sleek corporate jet that looked like something from a movie about impossibly wealthy people. The aircraft bore the Skyglide Airlines logo in understated gold lettering, and its pristine white fuselage gleamed in the morning sunlight. He'd seen private jets before from a distance, but standing beside one, feeling the residual heat from its engines and breathing the aviation fuel-scented air, drove home just how dramatically his morning had diverged from anything he could have imagined. "She's a Gulfstream G650, Sarah explained as they approached the aircraft. "One of our executive fleet. Mrs. Carrington prefers her for shorter regional trips." Damien nodded as if this information meant something to him, though his experience with aircraft was limited to the commercial flights he'd taken, perhaps a dozen times in his life. The stairs leading into the cabin were carpeted, and he could see through the open door that the interior bore no resemblance to the cramped commercial aircraft he was familiar with. "First time on a private jet?" Sylvia asked, noting his expression. "First time on any kind of jet in about 3 years," Damien admitted. "This is considerably more impressive than Southwest Airlines." Sylvia laughed a sound that was both elegant and genuinely amused. "I started Skyglide as a regional carrier with 3 used planes and a dream of making air travel more humane. Sometimes I think we've moved too far from those roots, but I suppose there are advantages to success." The cabin interior was everything Damien had expected and more. Rich leather seats were arranged in conversation groupings rather than the utilitarian rows of commercial aircraft. The lighting was warm and adjustable, the carpeting thick enough to absorb sound, and the overall atmosphere suggested a high-end hotel suite that happened to be capable of flight. "Please, sit anywhere you'd like," Sarah said, gesturing toward the seating options. "Flight time to Atlanta is about 45 minutes. Damien chose a seat that faced forward, partly out of habit and partly because it felt less presumptuous than one of the conversation groupings. Sylvia settled across from him with the ease of someone for whom private jet travel was routine, while Sarah took a seat at a small conference table and opened her laptop dock as the aircraft began to taxi. Damien found himself studying the menu card that had been placed beside his seat. The selection included items he recognized: sandwiches, salads, coffee, but described in language that suggested ingredients and preparation methods far beyond anything he'd experienced. Farm-to-table organic greens with house-made vinaigrette, locally sourced artisanal cheese selection, single-origin Ethiopian coffee roasted this morning. "The catering is a bit much, isn't it?" Sylvia said, noticing his expression. "Sarah insists on maintaining certain standards, even for short flights." "It's very thoughtful," Damien replied diplomatically, though privately he was calculating that this single meal probably cost more than he typically spent on groceries in a week. "When I was starting the airline," Sylvia continued as they reached cruising altitude, "I flew commercial constantly, studying how other carriers operated. I spent a lot of time in middle seats between crying babies and businessmen who thought the armrest belonged exclusively to them. I swore that if Skyglide ever became successful enough for executive aircraft, I'd never forget what normal passengers experience. Do you think you've succeeded in that?" Damien asked, accepting a cup of the Ethiopian coffee from the flight attendant. The coffee was, predictably, extraordinary. "Some days better than others," Sylvia admitted. "It's easy to lose perspective when you're insulated from the realities your customers face. That's why I still make the incognito flights, why I read every complaint letter personally, Why I try to spend time in our facilities, talking to frontline employees. Damien sipped his coffee and considered this. In his construction and maintenance work, he'd encountered plenty of executives who made decisions about worker safety and comfort without ever experiencing the consequences of those decisions themselves. The fact that Sylvia made an effort to maintain that connection spoke well of her leadership style. "Tell me about your daughter," Sylvia said, settling back in her seat with her own coffee. "Leela, was it?" "Yes." Damon's face softened automatically at the mention of his daughter. "She's 12, incredibly bright, loves to read. She's been essentially raising herself for the past few years, while I've been struggling to keep us afloat financially. That must be difficult for both of you." "It is. She's had to grow up faster than any kid should. We live in a studio apartment, share everything, and she's never complained. Not once. She does her homework at the kitchen table while I cook dinner. Helps with grocery shopping. Even helps me prepare for job interviews." He paused, thinking of the card she'd made him that morning. "She deserves so much better than what I've been able to provide." "What does she want to be when she grows up?" "Changes every few months," Damien replied with a smile. "Last month it was marine biologist. This month she's leaning toward aerospace engineer. She checked out every book the library had about space exploration." "Aerospace engineering," Sylvia repeated thoughtfully. "That's not a field many 12-year-olds even know exists." She's always been curious about how things work. When she was 8, she took apart our old radio to see what was inside. Couldn't put it back together, but she understood the concept of circuits and speakers afterward. Sarah looked up from her laptop. "Georgia Tech has an excellent aerospace program." "Georgia Tech costs money we don't have," Damien replied, though without bitterness. "But she's smart enough that maybe scholarships, financial aid, we'll figure something out when the time comes." "What if the time comes sooner than you think?" Sylvia asked Dot before Damien could ask what she meant. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into Atlanta. Through the aircraft's large windows, Damien could see the city spreading out below them, a sprawling metropolitan area that represented opportunities and possibilities that had always seemed beyond his reach. "The facility we're visiting is about 20 minutes from the airport," Sarah explained, consulting her tablet. "It's our primary southeastern maintenance hub, responsible for routine maintenance and major overhauls for about 30% of our fleet." "How many people work there?" "About 250 total," Sylvia replied. "The maintenance supervisor position oversees the day-to-day operations of about 40 maintenance technicians, plus coordination with safety inspectors, parts procurement, and scheduling." Damien felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. Supervising a team of 40 was significantly larger than any crew he'd managed before, and the aviation industry's safety standards were notoriously demanding. But the core principles were the same as any maintenance operation: keep equipment running safely, efficiently, and cost-effectively. "What happened to the previous supervisor?" he asked. "Retirement," Sarah answered. Harold Chun had been in the position for 15 years. Excellent safety record, well respected by his team, but he's 72 and wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren. "So you're looking for someone who can maintain the standards he established while bringing fresh energy to the role," Damien interpreted. "Exactly." Sylvia leaned forward slightly. "The aviation industry is heavily regulated, but within those regulations, there's room for innovation and improvement. We need someone who respects the established safety protocols, but isn't afraid to suggest better ways of doing things." As the aircraft began its final approach, Damien found himself looking down at a landscape that might soon become familiar highways and neighborhoods, industrial complexes and office buildings that could become part of his daily routine. The transformation from his morning's desperation to this afternoon's possibility felt surreal, but increasingly real. The landing was smooth enough that Damien barely felt the touchdown. Another reminder of the difference between this aircraft and commercial aviation. As they taxied toward the private aviation terminal, he could see the main airport in the distance, with commercial aircraft lined up at gates and the constant movement of ground support vehicles. "Ready to see your potential new workplace?" Sylvia asked as the aircraft came to a stop. Damien nodded, though he wasn't sure anyone could truly be ready for the kind of life change that seemed to be unfolding. But he was willing to find out what possibilities this strange day might hold. The Skyglide maintenance facility was larger than Damien had expected, a sprawling complex of hangars and administrative buildings that spoke of serious industrial operations. As their car approached the main gate, he could see aircraft in various stages of maintenance, some with engines removed, others with panels open, revealing complex internal systems, all surrounded by technicians in coveralls who moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who understood that lives depended on their work. "Impressive, isn't it?" Sylvia said, following his gaze. "When we built this facility 12 years ago, it was designed to handle our entire southeastern fleet. We've expanded twice since then." The security checkpoint was thorough but efficient, with guards who clearly recognized Sylvia, but still followed proper protocols for visitor badges and vehicle inspection. Damien noted the professionalism: no shortcuts, no assumptions, just careful adherence to procedures that were obviously taken seriously. Inside the main hangar, the scale of the operation became even more apparent. A massive Skyglide aircraft, Boeing 737, Sarah informed him, dominated the space. Its fuselage supported by hydraulic jacks, while technicians worked on its landing gear. The organized chaos was familiar to Damien from construction sites, but the precision and cleanliness were beyond anything he'd experienced in industrial maintenance. "Safety is everything in aviation," Sylvia explained as they walked through the facility. "One mistake, one shortcut, one failure to follow protocol, and people die. It's that simple." They were met by Marcus Williams, the facility manager, a tall, soft-spoken man in his 40s, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone deeply experienced in his field. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct, and his first questions were about Damien's safety philosophy rather than his technical qualifications. "Mrs. Carrington tells me you might be interested in Harold's old position," Marcus said as they walked through the maintenance bays. "It's demanding work. 40 technicians, round-the-clock operations, FAA inspections that happen without warning. But it's also rewarding if you're the kind of person who takes pride in keeping aircraft safe." "What's the biggest challenge in the role?" Damien asked, watching a team carefully remove an engine component with movements that spoke of extensive training and absolute precision. "Balancing efficiency with thoroughness," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Corporate wants aircraft back in service as quickly as possible. Every day a plane sits in maintenance is lost revenue, but safety can't be compromised, ever. Sometimes that creates tension. How do you handle that tension?" "By hiring supervisors who understand that our reputation and our passengers' lives are worth more than a few hours of flight time," Marcus said, glancing at Sylvia. Harold never wavered on safety standards. Neither can his replacement. They paused beside a workstation where a technician was documenting her inspection of hydraulic lines, photographing each connection and entering detailed notes into a tablet. The process was methodical, thorough, and obviously routine, kind of systematic approach that Damien recognized as the foundation of reliable maintenance operations. "Every inspection is documented," Marcus explained. "Every part replacement is tracked. Every deviation from standard procedure requires supervisor approval and additional review. It might seem like overkill, but when you're responsible for 300 passengers and crew, overkill is exactly what you want." As they continued the tour, Damien found himself asking increasingly detailed questions about procedures, staffing, and operational challenges. The technical aspects were different from his construction experience, but the fundamental principles were remarkably similar. Both industries required absolute attention to detail, systematic approaches to complex problems, and unwavering commitment to safety standards. What do you think? Sylvia asked as they settled into Marcus's office for coffee and more detailed discussion. It's intimidating, Damien admitted. The scale, the complexity, the responsibility, it's significantly more than anything I've managed before. But the principles are familiar. Keep equipment running safely, maintain detailed records, manage teams effectively, never compromise on safety. Those are universal in any maintenance operation. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right answer. The specifics can be learned. The attitude has to be built in. Tell me about the team, Damien said. What are they like to work with? Dedicated professionals, mostly, Marcus replied. Average tenure is about 8 years, which is good for this industry. They take pride in their work, understand the importance of what they do. Harold was well respected because he backed his people when they made safety calls, even when it meant delays or increased costs. Have there been situations where safety and efficiency conflicted? Regularly, Marcus said frankly. Last month, a technician found a stress crack in a wing component during routine inspection. Officially, it was within acceptable parameters. Could have signed off on it, but she was uncomfortable with the crack's location and recommended replacement. That decision grounded the aircraft for 3 additional days and cost about $50,000 in parts and labor. What did Harold do? Backed her completely. Ordered the replacement, documented the decision, and made sure she knew she'd done exactly the right thing. Turned out the crack was worse than initial inspection suggested. If we'd missed it, it could have been catastrophic. Damien absorbed this, understanding the weight of such decisions. And upper management supported that call? I did, Sylvia interjected, and I always will. We've built Skyglide's reputation on safety, and that reputation is worth far more than any short-term cost savings. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small framed photograph, setting it on Marcus's desk where Damien could see it. The image showed a much younger Sylvia standing beside a small aircraft, her hand resting proudly on its wing. That's my first plane, she said, her voice carrying the weight of memory. A used Cessna 172 that I bought with my life savings, and a loan I probably couldn't afford. I learned to fly in that plane, started giving flying lessons to pay for maintenance and fuel. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Damien studied the photograph, noting the determination in young Sylvia's eyes, the way she stood as if claiming ownership of her future. What happened to it? Still have it, actually. It's hangared at my private airstrip. I still take it up sometimes when I need to remember where all this started. She paused, her gaze growing distant. My husband used to say that plane represented everything good about aviation: simple, reliable, honest. No corporate politics, no quarterly profit pressures, just the fundamental challenge of keeping something mechanical and complex working safely. Your husband was a pilot too? Aircraft mechanic, actually. Robert understood aircraft systems better than anyone I ever met. He could diagnose problems just by listening to an engine, spot potential failures before they showed up on instruments. He taught me that safety isn't about following rules. It's about truly understanding your equipment and respecting what can go wrong. There was something in Sylvia's voice when she spoke about her husband that suggested loss, and Damien felt the familiar recognition of someone who understood what it meant to face life's challenges alone. He sounds like someone who would have understood the importance of what you do here, Damien said carefully. He would have, Sylvia agreed. He died 15 years ago. Heart attack at 62. Never got to see Skyglide become what it is today, but I think he'd be proud of the safety culture we've built. The shared understanding of loss hung in the air between them. Two people who had faced the challenge of moving forward after life had taken away someone essential. It added another layer to the connection that had begun that morning in the airport, a recognition that both understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of the people depending on them. The position comes with significant benefits, Marcus said, steering the conversation back to practical matters. Health insurance that covers dependents, tuition assistance programs, retirement matching, and the salary range Mrs. Carrington mentioned is just the starting point. Performance reviews happen annually, and advancement opportunities exist throughout the Skyglide organization. As they discussed details and answered Damien's questions, he found himself increasingly convinced that this opportunity represented far more than just employment. It was a chance to be part of something important, to use his skills in service of safety and reliability that truly mattered. And perhaps, most importantly, it was a chance to provide Lila with the security and opportunities she deserved. Back in Marcus's office, Sarah opened her laptop and turned the screen toward Damien. What he saw was a formal job description complete with salary details, benefit packages, and performance expectations laid out in corporate formatting that made everything suddenly, tangibly real. Maintenance Supervisor, Southeast Regional Facility, he read aloud. Salary range, $85,000 to $110,000 annually, depending on experience and performance. Full medical, dental, and vision coverage for employee and dependents. Tuition assistance up to $15,000 annually for employee children. 4 weeks paid vacation, sick leave, and personal days. The numbers seemed to blur together as Damien processed what he was seeing. Not only was the base salary more than he'd dared hope for, but the benefits package represented security he'd never been able to provide for Lila. Health insurance alone would save them hundreds of dollars monthly, and the tuition assistance could transform her educational opportunities. There's more, Sylvia said, noting his expression. Skyglide has partnerships with several regional universities. Employees, children who meet academic standards, can qualify for additional scholarship funding beyond the tuition assistance. How much additional funding? Damien asked, though he almost didn't want to know. The offer was already beyond anything he'd imagined. Full tuition coverage at any state university, plus assistance with room and board, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. We've found that investing in our employees' families creates stronger, more committed team members. Damien sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what was being offered. This is incredible, but I have to ask, what's the catch? There's always a catch. Marcus and Sylvia exchanged glances, and Damien sensed he'd touched on something important. The catch, Marcus said slowly, is that this position requires absolute commitment to our safety standards, even when that commitment creates conflicts with operational pressures. Are you prepared to ground a $50 million aircraft because your gut tells you something isn't right, even if the paperwork says it's acceptable? Yes, Damien replied without hesitation. Are you prepared to have difficult conversations with pilots who want to push schedules, with corporate executives who prioritize profit margins, with your own team members when they want to take shortcuts? Yes, even when those conversations might make you unpopular, even when they might affect your performance reviews or advancement opportunities. Damien thought about Lila, about the years of financial struggle, about the security this position could provide. Then he thought about the passengers who would trust their lives to aircraft he was responsible for maintaining. Especially then, he said firmly. Sylvia leaned forward, her sharp eyes studying his face. There's something else you should know about this position, Mr. Reyes. Something that makes it different from most corporate jobs. What's that? I'm personally invested in its success. This facility, this position, the safety culture we've built here, it's part of my legacy, the foundation of everything Skyglide represents. Whoever takes Harold's place isn't just joining our company. They're becoming stewards of standards that took decades to develop. Sarah consulted her laptop again. Mrs. Carrington reviews the performance of key safety positions quarterly, not through reports or secondhand information, but through direct observation and conversation. Which means, Sylvia continued, that you'll be working for someone who understands exactly what you're doing and why it matters. But it also means you'll be held to standards that go beyond typical corporate expectations. Damien considered this. Working directly under the scrutiny of the company's founder could be intimidating, but it also suggested that safety would truly be the priority, not just corporate rhetoric. What would my start date be? 2 weeks, Marcus replied. Harold agreed to stay on for transition training, and we'd want you to spend that time learning our specific procedures and getting to know the team. And the location? You mentioned this is based in Atlanta, but I'd need to consider logistics. Actually, Sylvia interrupted. There's been a development since this morning. Sarah, show him the housing assistance information. Sarah pulled up another document. Skyglide offers relocation assistance for key positions, but we've also recently acquired corporate housing near this facility. Furnished apartments available for employees at significantly below market rates. How significantly below market? Damien asked. About 60% of local rental prices, Sarah replied. The apartments are nice 2 bedrooms, study areas suitable for a student, located in a district with excellent schools. Damien felt his world shifting again. Not only was the job offer beyond his wildest expectations, but they were solving problems he hadn't even begun to articulate. Moving to Atlanta would mean disrupting Lila's life, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known, but it would also mean opportunities he could never provide in their current situation. The school district rating? He asked, knowing Lila would want to know. Top 10% in the state, Marcus replied. Strong STEM programs, advanced placement courses, college preparation that's among the best in the region. And if Lila wants to pursue aerospace engineering, Georgia Tech is less than 30 minutes away, Sylvia added. She could potentially take dual enrollment courses during high school, get a head start on her college education. The offer was becoming almost surreal in its completeness. Every concern Damien might raise seemed to have been anticipated and addressed. It was either an incredible stroke of fortune or too good to be true, and he wasn't sure which possibility was more frightening. I need to discuss this with Lila, he said finally. This would be a huge change for our new school, new city, leaving behind everything familiar. Of course, Sylvia agreed, but perhaps she'd like to see what we're offering before you make a final decision. You want her to visit Atlanta? I want her to understand what her future could look like, Sylvia replied. Sometimes the biggest limitation on our dreams is simply not knowing what's possible. Sarah was already working on her laptop again. There's a Skyglide flight leaving for your hometown at 4:30 this afternoon. That would get you home in time for dinner with Lila. Then, if you're both interested, we could arrange for you to bring her back this weekend to see the facility, visit the schools, get a feel for the area. On another corporate jet? Commercial flight, Sylvia said with a smile. First class, but commercial. I don't want to overwhelm the poor child completely. Damien looked around the office, at the job description still displayed on Sarah's laptop, at the framed photograph of Sylvia's first airplane, at Marcus, who was watching this conversation with the patient attention of someone who understood exactly how life-changing this moment could be. Can I call her? He asked. I'd like to hear her voice before I make any decisions. Of course, Sylvia replied, standing. Take all the time you need. Marcus and I will be in the hangar if you have any other questions. As they left him alone in the office, Damien pulled out his phone and stared at Lila's number. In a few minutes, he would either be telling his daughter that their struggles were over, or explaining why her father had been offered everything they'd ever dreamed of, and still wasn't sure it was real. Damien's hands trembled slightly as he dialed Lila's number. Through Marcus's office window, he could see technicians working on the Boeing 737, their movements precise and unhurried despite the complexity of their tasks. In a few hours, passengers would board that aircraft, trusting that every bolt, every wire, every system had been properly maintained and inspected. The weight of that responsibility felt both overwhelming and oddly comforting. "Dad?" Leela's voice came through clear and bright, carrying the familiar mix of excitement and worry that had characterized their relationship since his unemployment began. "How did the interview go? Are you okay?" "I've been checking the time every 5 minutes." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Damien said, settling back in Marcus's chair. But the interview, well, it didn't go exactly as planned. He could hear the sharp intake of breath that meant Lila was preparing herself for disappointment. She'd become too good at managing her expectations, too skilled at finding silver linings in situations that offered none. "It's okay, Dad," she said with forced brightness. "There will be other opportunities. Maybe we can look at local jobs again, or—" "Lila," he interrupted gently, "what if I told you that instead of getting the job I interviewed for, I got offered?" "A better one?" Silence. Then, cautiously, "What kind of better?" "The kind that comes with health insurance for both of us. The kind that pays enough for us to get a real apartment with separate bedrooms. The kind that includes tuition assistance for your college education." Another pause, longer this time. When Lila spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than her usual confident tone. "Dad, are you making fun of me? Because if this is a joke, it's not a joke, sweetheart. I'm sitting in an office at an airport maintenance facility in Atlanta, and they've offered me a position as maintenance supervisor with a salary that's more than we've ever dreamed of." "Atlanta?" The word came out sharp with surprise. That's far away. About 2 hours from home," Damien confirmed. It would mean moving, changing schools, starting over in a new place. He could hear her breathing, could almost see her face as she processed this information. Layla had always been analytical, approaching problems with the systematic thinking that served her well in school, but sometimes made emotional decisions more challenging. "Tell me about the job," she said finally. Damien described the facility, the position, the responsibilities involved in overseeing aircraft maintenance operations. As he talked, he found himself emphasizing the safety aspects, the technical challenges, the opportunity to be part of something that truly mattered. Leela listened without interruption, asking only an occasional clarifying question. "And the people you'd work with?" she asked when he finished, professional, serious about safety. "The kind of people who understand that cutting corners isn't an option when lives are at stake." "Like you," Lila said, and there was pride in her voice that made Damien's throat tighten. "I hope so. What about the schools? If we moved to Atlanta, what would that mean for my education?" Damien smiled, recognizing his daughter's priorities. Even faced with life-changing news, her first concern was academic. Top 10% in the state, strong STEM programs. And Lila, Georgia Tech is less than 30 minutes away. If you're still interested in aerospace engineering when you're older, you could potentially take college courses while you're still in high school. The silence that followed was different, not hesitation or worry, but the focused quiet of someone whose imagination had just been expanded beyond previous boundaries. "Georgia Tech has one of the best aerospace programs in the country," she said slowly. "I know. And you said tuition assistance?" "Full coverage for state universities, plus help with room and board." "Dad," Layla's voice had dropped to a whisper, "that's everything we've ever talked about, everything we've hoped for." "I know, sweetheart, but Atlanta is far from everything we know. I'd have to leave my school, my teachers, the library where I know all the librarians." Damien heard the conflict in her voice, excitement, warring with fear of the unknown. It was the same internal battle he'd been fighting since Sylvia first mentioned the position. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, genuinely wanting her input. "I think," Lila said carefully, "that we should learn more before we decide." Can we visit? Can I see the schools? The area where we'd live? They've offered to fly us both back this weekend, so you can see everything firsthand. On the corporate jet? Damien laughed. Commercial flight, first class. Apparently, Mrs. Carrington doesn't want to overwhelm you completely. Mrs. Carrington is the one who offered you the job? It's a long story. I'll tell you everything when I get home tonight. Dad? Lila's voice had grown serious again. Is this real? This isn't going to disappear like other opportunities have? The question hit Damien hard, reminding him of how many times their hopes had been raised, only to be dashed by economic realities or circumstances beyond their control. Lila had learned to be cautious about good news, to protect herself from disappointment by not believing too completely in positive possibilities. I think it's real, he said honestly. But you're right to be cautious. We should ask questions, examine every detail, make sure we understand exactly what we're getting into. Okay. She paused, and when she spoke again, there was a note of excitement she couldn't quite suppress. But Dad, if it is real, if this really happens, we could have our own rooms. I could have bookshelves. You wouldn't have to worry about money all the time. That's the idea. And you'd be doing important work, safety work that matters. Yes. Then I think we should seriously consider it, even if it means leaving everything familiar behind. Damien felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter's maturity, her ability to weigh possibilities against risks and come to a reasoned conclusion. At 12, she was already demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking that would serve her well in whatever field she ultimately chose. There's one more thing, he said. Mrs. Carrington wants to meet you. She's very interested in making sure you're comfortable with this decision. She wants to meet me? Why? I think she understands that you're the most important factor in any decision I make. She knows this job offer only works if it's good for both of us. What's she like? Damien considered how to describe Sylvia Carrington, the medical emergency that had revealed her vulnerability, the sharp intelligence that had assessed his character, the personal investment she seemed to have in his success. Complicated, he said finally. Brilliant, definitely. Someone who's built something important and wants to make sure it's in good hands. I think you'd like her. I'd like to meet her, Lila said with the decisiveness that always appeared when she'd made up her mind about something. When do we leave for Atlanta? If we decide to go, Friday afternoon. But Lila, Dad, I know you're worried about disrupting my life, about asking me to give up everything familiar. But you know what? Everything familiar isn't that great. Our apartment is too small. Our neighborhood isn't safe, and my school doesn't have the resources for advanced programs. Sometimes familiar just means comfortable with limitations. Damien stared out at the maintenance hangar, watching technicians who were passionate about their work, who took pride in the precision and importance of what they did every day. For the first time in years, he was looking at a future that offered more than just survival. So we're doing this? He asked. We're considering it seriously, Lila corrected. But Dad, I'm proud of you. Whatever happened today, whatever opportunity this represents, you earned it. And if it means I get to see Georgia Tech's campus in person, well, that's just a bonus. As Damien ended the call and prepared to rejoin Sylvia and Marcus, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine optimism about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adjustments this opportunity would require, he and Lila would face them together, and for the first time in a long time, they'd be facing them from a position of strength rather than desperation. When Damien found Sylvia and Marcus in the hangar, they were deep in conversation with a technician who was explaining the intricacies of engine maintenance scheduling. Sylvia listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely understood the technical details being discussed, asking questions that demonstrated both knowledge and respect for the expertise of frontline workers. How did your conversation with Lila go? She asked as the technician returned to his work. Better than I expected, Damien replied. She's cautious, which is smart given our history, but she's interested. She wants to visit this weekend, see the schools, meet you, if that's still something you'd like to do. I'd be delighted to meet her, Sylvia said warmly. Bright children who faced adversity often have perspectives that adults can learn from. Marcus consulted his watch. If you're planning to catch that 4:30 flight, we should probably head back to the airport soon. But first, he gestured toward a conference room visible through glass walls at the far end of the hangar. There's some paperwork we should handle. The conference room was simply furnished, but professional, with a large table surrounded by chairs and windows that looked out onto the maintenance operations. Sarah was already there, her laptop open and several documents spread across the table in organized stacks. If you're ready to move forward, she said, we have the employment contract prepared for your review. Damien took the document she offered, official letterhead, legal language, and details that made everything suddenly irrevocably real. As he read through the terms, each clause seemed to confirm that this opportunity was exactly what it appeared to be: comprehensive, generous, and structured to provide long-term security for both him and Lila. Take your time, Sylvia said, settling into a chair across from him. Read everything carefully. Ask questions about anything you don't understand. The contract was thorough, but straightforward. Salary details matched what they'd discussed. Benefits were clearly outlined, and the performance expectations were demanding but fair. There were clauses about safety compliance, continuing education requirements, and advancement opportunities within the Skyglide organization. The probationary period is 90 days, Damien noted. Standard for supervisory positions, Marcus. Confirmed. But given the circumstances of your hiring and Mrs. Carrington's personal recommendation, I'd say that's more formality than genuine concern. What happens if it doesn't work out? Damien asked. If I'm not suited for aviation maintenance, or if the team doesn't accept my leadership, then we'll know within those 90 days, Sylvia replied honestly. But Mr. Reyes, I've spent 47 years building this company by learning to read people accurately. This morning, you demonstrated exactly the kind of character and judgment I want in someone responsible for safety operations. I'm not worried about your ability to succeed in this role. Sarah handed him a pen, not a disposable ballpoint, but something substantial, with weight and importance that seemed appropriate for signing documents that would reshape his life. Before you sign, Sylvia said, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity. This isn't me feeling sorry for someone who's had a difficult time. This is a business decision based on my assessment of your qualifications and character. Skyglide succeeds when we hire people who share our values and commitment to excellence. I understand, Damien replied, and I appreciate that distinction. Good, because I expect you to hold yourself and your team to the highest standards. I expect you to make decisions based on safety rather than convenience. And I expect you to remember that every aircraft that leaves this facility carries people who trust us with their lives. Damien looked down at the contract, then at the maintenance. Operations visible through the conference room windows. Technicians moved with practiced efficiency, each focused on tasks that seemed routine but carried enormous responsibility. In a few weeks, he could be supervising those operations, ensuring that Skyglide's safety standards were maintained and exceeded. What made you start the airline? He asked Sylvia suddenly. She smiled at the unexpected question. Stubbornness, mostly. I was a pilot when there weren't many women in aviation. I got tired of being told what I couldn't do, so I decided to create a company where competence mattered more than convention. And it worked, eventually. We nearly went bankrupt twice in the first 5 years. But we survived because we focused on doing things right rather than doing things cheaply. Safety, reliability, treating people well, those principles kept us going when everything else failed. Damien picked up the pen, feeling its weight, Those are principles I can support. I hoped you'd say that. He signed his name with careful deliberation, each letter committing him to a future that had been unimaginable when he'd awakened that morning. As he completed the signature, Sylvia extended her hand across the table. "Welcome to Skyglide, Mr. Reyes. I look forward to working with you." Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct, and for the first time in years, Damien felt like he was shaking hands with someone who saw him as an equal rather than a supplicant. The contract was complete, the decision made, and his life, Lila's life, was about to change in ways that still seemed too good to be true. "Your first day is Monday, 2 weeks from now," Marcus said, collecting the signed documents. "Harold will be here for transition training, and will make sure you have everything you need to succeed." As they prepared to leave for the airport, Damien took one last look around the conference room, trying to memorize the moment when everything changed. In his wallet, Lila's hand-drawn good luck card was pressed against his new Skyglide employee identification, tangible symbols of where he'd been and where he was going. As they walked back toward the parking area, Sylvia fell into step beside Damien, her pace unhurried despite the approaching flight time. The afternoon sun was warm, and the constant background hum of aircraft operations created a soundtrack of productivity and purpose. "There's something else I'd like to discuss," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a business card. Unlike the formal corporate card she'd shown him earlier, this one was simpler, just her name, a personal phone number, and an email address. "My personal contact information." Damien accepted the card, noting the quality of the paper and the understated elegance of the design. "Thank you. Should I expect to report directly to you?" "Not in the traditional sense," Sylvia replied. "Marcus is your immediate supervisor, and the normal corporate hierarchy applies for day-to-day operations. But Mr. Reyes, Damien, I want you to understand that I consider safety personnel to be the guardians of our company's most important values. That comes with privileges and responsibilities beyond the standard employee handbook." "What kind of privileges?" "Direct access to me when safety concerns arise. If you ever encounter pressure to compromise safety standards, if you ever feel that operational demands are conflicting with proper maintenance protocols, I want to know immediately." They paused beside the car that would take them back to the airport. Through the chain-link fence, Damien could see aircraft lined up on the tarmac, each one representing hundreds of passengers who would trust Skyglide to get them safely to their destinations. And their responsibilities? Honesty, complete transparency about operational challenges, willingness to make difficult decisions, even when they're unpopular. Sylvia's expression grew serious. The aviation industry is unforgiving of shortcuts and compromises. One failure, one moment of carelessness, and people die. I need to know that everyone in a safety-critical position understands that responsibility completely." "I do understand," Damien said. "But I have to ask, what if my decisions as maintenance supervisor conflict with corporate priorities? What if doing the right thing for safety puts me at odds with operational efficiency?" "Then you do the right thing for safety," Sylvia replied, "without hesitation, always. And you call me if anyone suggests otherwise." Sarah approached from the administrative building, carrying a leather portfolio and walking with the efficient pace of someone managing a tight schedule. "All set," she announced. "Mr. Reyes's employment paperwork is complete, and I've arranged for security credentials to be processed this week, so everything will be ready for his start date." "What about housing assistance?" Damien asked. "If Lila and I decide to make the move, how quickly could we arrange for one of the corporate apartments?" "Immediately," Sarah replied, consulting her tablet. "I can have keys available by this weekend if you'd like to see the actual unit during your visit." The efficiency was overwhelming. Every practical concern Damien raised seemed to have been anticipated and addressed before he could fully articulate it. "Mrs. Carrington," he said as they got into the car. "I have to ask, why are you personally involved in this hiring decision? Surely you have HR departments, managers, people whose job it is to handle recruitment." Sylvia settled back in her seat as the car pulled away from the facility. "Do you have children, Damien?" "Just Lila." "I never had children," Sylvia said quietly. "Robert and I tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. So Skyglide became my legacy, the thing I'd leave behind that mattered. The safety culture, the standards we've built, the way we treat both employees and passengers. That's my family in a way." She paused, watching the landscape pass by as they drove toward the airport. "When I see someone like you, a good father, someone who makes sacrifices for others without expecting anything in return, I see the kind of person I want protecting that legacy. That's a lot of responsibility to put on someone you met this morning. Perhaps. But I've learned to trust my instincts about people. This morning, when you missed your flight to help a stranger, you demonstrated exactly the kind of character I want in someone responsible for safety operations." She turned to look at him directly. "Plus, I'm not entirely trusting my instincts alone. Your background check was quite thorough." "How thorough?" Sarah answered from the front seat. "We spoke with your former supervisors, reviewed your safety record, checked your financial history, even talked to Lila's teachers." "Her teachers said wonderful things," Sylvia added. "Bright, well-adjusted, mature for her age despite difficult circumstances. That tells me a lot about the kind of parent you are." Damien felt a mix of pride and slight unease at the extent of their investigation. And if he'd found something concerning in that background check, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Sylvia replied matter-of-factly, "I believe in second chances and redemption, but not when it comes to safety-critical positions. Some mistakes are too important to overlook." As they arrived at the airport and prepared to board the commercial flight back home, Sylvia handed Damien one final document. "Lila's acceptance letter," she said with a slight smile. "Acceptance letter to what?" "Georgia Tech's summer science program for gifted middle school students. It's a 3-week intensive program that introduces students to engineering concepts. I took the liberty of nominating her based on her academic record." Damien stared at the official letterhead, at his daughter's name printed in formal university typography. "She hasn't even decided if we're moving to Atlanta yet." "The program doesn't require relocation," Sylvia explained. "Its residential students stay in university housing for the 3 weeks. And it's fully funded through Skyglide's Educational Partnership Program." "Why would you do this?" "Because bright children deserve opportunities to explore their potential. And because if Lila is going to be part of the Skyglide family, I want her to have every advantage we can provide." As they boarded the flight first-class seats that represented a luxury Damien had never experienced, he found himself holding 2 pieces of paper that symbolized the complete transformation of his life: his signed employment contract and Lila's acceptance letter to a program he'd never dreamed she could access. "Thank you," he said as the aircraft began to taxi. "For everything. For the job, for believing in me, for thinking about Lila's future. Thank you for helping an old woman in an airport when you had everything to lose and nothing to gain," Sylvia replied. "Character reveals itself in moments like that, and I'm grateful I was there to see yours." As the plane lifted off and Atlanta fell away below them, Damien realized that in less than 12 hours, he'd gone from desperate unemployment to a career opportunity that exceeded his wildest hopes. But more than that, he'd found something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose and belonging that promised to transform not just his financial situation, but his entire relationship with his work and his future. 3 months later, Damien stood in the doorway of his office at the Skyglide maintenance facility, watching his team conduct the morning safety briefing. The rhythm of their operations had become familiar, systematic, thorough, professional in a way that spoke of shared commitment to excellence. Through his window, he could see aircraft in various stages of maintenance, each one a testament to the precision and care that defined their work. His Skyglide employee badge hung from a retractable cord on his belt. A plastic rectangle that had seemed so significant on his first day now worn and familiar. The badge represented more than just employment. It symbolized belonging to something important, being part of a team whose work truly mattered. "Dad?" Lila's voice carried across the hangar floor, and Damien looked up to see his daughter approaching with the confident stride she'd developed since they'd moved to Atlanta. She wore a Georgia Tech t-shirt from her summer science program, her arms full of library books that were actually hers now, rather than borrowed on extended loan. "How was school?" he asked as she reached his office. "Incredible," she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. "We started our aerospace engineering unit today. Mrs. Patterson said I could present my project from the tech program to the class." Damien smiled, noting the enthusiasm in her voice that had replaced the careful optimism of their earlier conversations. The move to Atlanta had been challenging. New school, new friends, new routines, but Lila had embraced it with the adaptability that continued to amaze him. "And how are you liking the advanced math class?" "Love it. The work is actually challenging. Once." She paused, studying his face with the perceptive intelligence that reminded him daily how lucky he was to be her father. "You look happy, Dad. Really happy. Not just pretending everything is fine happy." "I am happy," he admitted. "This job, this place, it's everything I hoped it would be, and more." Through his office window, they could see Sylvia Carrington walking through the hangar with Marcus, both of them deep in conversation with one of the senior technicians. Her quarterly inspection had become something the team looked forward to rather than dreaded, an opportunity to showcase their work rather than defend their decisions. "Is Mrs. Carrington coming to dinner this Sunday?" Lila asked, following his gaze. "If her schedule allows it," Damien replied. The weekly dinners had become a tradition. Sylvia would join them at their apartment for simple meals and conversation that ranged from aviation safety to Lila's academic interests to stories about the early days of Skyglide Airlines. "I want to show her my college application essays," Lila said. "She said she'd review them before I submit to Georgia Tech." "College applications already? You're only in 8th grade. Mrs. Carrington says it's never too early to start thinking about the future. Plus, with the dual enrollment program, I could potentially start taking college courses next year." The transformation in Lila's educational opportunities still amazed Damien. The school district's advanced programs, combined with her proximity to Georgia Tech and Sylvia's mentorship, had opened doors he'd never imagined possible. His daughter was thriving in ways that justified every risk they'd taken in making this move. Marcus appeared in his office doorway, carrying a tablet and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just completed a successful inspection. "Sylvia wants to see you in conference room A when you have a minute," he said. Nothing urgent, but she mentioned it was important. Damien found Sylvia in the conference room where he'd signed his employment contract 3 months earlier. She sat at the same table, surrounded by documents and laptops, but her expression was warmer and more relaxed than it had been during that first intense meeting. "How are you settling in?" she asked as he took a seat across from her. "Better than I expected," Damien replied honestly. "The team has been incredibly supportive. The work is challenging but manageable, and Lila is happier than I've seen her in years." "Good. That's what I hope to hear." Sylvia consulted a document in front of her. "Your 90-day performance review was exemplary, by the way. Marcus says you've already identified several areas for operational improvement, and the team respects your leadership style. I have good people to work with. They make my job easier." "Spoken like a true leader," Sylvia said with approval. "But I didn't ask you here to discuss performance reviews. I have a proposition for you." She turned her laptop screen toward him, displaying what appeared to be organizational charts and facility layouts. Skyglide is expanding our maintenance operations. We're opening a new facility in Denver next year, and we need someone to oversee the startup operations and establish the safety culture from the ground up. Damien studied the information on the screen. You're offering me the Denver position? I'm offering you the opportunity to build something from scratch. You'd be responsible for hiring the team, establishing procedures, creating the training programs, essentially, taking everything you've learned here and using it to create a world-class maintenance operation. The scope of what she was describing was both exciting and intimidating. That's a significant increase in responsibility. With a significant increase in compensation, Sylvia replied, handing him another document. Plus relocation assistance, housing allowances, and educational benefits that would put Lila within reach of some of the best STEM programs in the country. Damien looked at the salary figures and felt the familiar disorientation of opportunities that exceeded his expectations. But this time, instead of desperate gratitude, he felt something more measured, the confidence of someone who had proven himself capable of rising to challenges. When would this transition happen? 18 months from now. Enough time for you to fully master your current role and help train your replacement here. Sylvia leaned back in her chair, studying his face. But I want you to understand that this offer comes with the same expectations I had when I hired you. Safety first, always. No compromises, no shortcuts, no exceptions. I wouldn't want it any other way. I know. That's why I'm offering it to you. As they discussed the details of the potential promotion, Damien found himself thinking about the morning 3 months ago when he'd helped a stranger in an airport and missed his flight to Dallas. That single act of compassion had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just his career, but his entire understanding of what was possible for him and Lila. "Can I ask you something?" he said as their meeting concluded. "Of course. Do you really believe that helping you that morning revealed something essential about my character? Or was it just coincidence that my impulsive decision happened to align with what you were looking for?" Sylvia considered the question thoughtfully. "I think character isn't about the decisions we make when we're trying to impress someone or achieve a particular outcome. It's about what we do when we think. No one important is watching when there's no obvious benefit to doing the right thing." She stood, gathering her documents with the efficient movements that characterized everything she did. "That morning, you thought you were helping a random elderly woman at considerable personal cost. You had no idea that your choice would lead to anything positive for you or Lila. That's exactly the kind of character I want in someone responsible for safety operations." As Damien returned to his office, he found Lila still there, reading one of her library books while waiting for him to finish work. She looked up as he entered, her eyes bright with curiosity about his meeting with Sylvia. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Everything's perfect," he replied, settling into his chair and looking out at the maintenance operations that had become his professional home. "Everything's exactly as it should be." Outside, another Skyglide aircraft was being prepared for flight, its maintenance complete, and its systems certified safe for the passengers, who would trust their lives to the work done in this hangar. In a few minutes, Damien would conduct his final inspection of the day, ensuring that every detail met the standards that had become second nature to him and his team. But for now, he sat with his daughter in his office, surrounded by the evidence of lives transformed by a single moment of compassion, grateful for the reminder that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that feel the most natural at the time.